I tell you a story about a girl. She likes to fly across the ocean with the air. She has no country, she doesn't care. She is a witch, she is a fairy killing bird. She needs no passports, she's everywhere. She burns the nights in Paris, breakfast in the...
Hi. In the first session of this week's lecture that we just went over, we looked at as part of the common characteristics of living thing, the first well-organized structurally the aspects and the metabolism to provide and utilize the energy. Actually, these two characteristics are related in terms of this, the organization with such a low entropy entity that requires the energy of a constant energy input to maintain the integrity and also to perform a lot of those synthetic reactions. So you do have to actually provide constant supply of these metabolic reactions. So that's why the metabolism becomes the integral part of the living system's characteristic. Now, the third characteristics that we are going to take a look at is also a little bit related with those two previous ones, but in this time it is about the awareness of the external environment. So it becomes the integral part of the living system's characteristics. Because of this, the external environment, what's going on, you have to be aware of what is going on. Otherwise, you cannot adjust yourself properly to the ever-changing external environment. So if outside environment stays the same, very stable and constant, you don't really actually have to worry too much about to make any adjustment. However, in reality, things are not like that. Quite the contrary. It is really changed dramatically in any minute. So if you neglect the surveillance of what's going on outside, then your chance of survival drops. So from that angle, we should view this feature of being responsive to the external stimulus. So how do you recognize what's going on in the outside environment? By sensing a lot of those stimulus, so plural stimuli, as clues of some of the parameter, environmental parameter is what it is. So to do so, you should be able to develop the antennas. If you were then comparing the cell as a type of like house or machines, so you should you better be equipped with many sensitive antennas and these proteins. So we call them as a sensor proteins, but in reality their nature is they are called some particular type of proteins called receptor proteins. They are usually embedded on the cell surface, on the cell membrane, like this cartoon. So here many other types of proteins are also shown to illustrate that not only is the receptor, but many other forms of proteins doing similar or quite the different functions must be present on the cell surface. So they are usually present in the form of like so-called, we describe this as an embedded. So these proteins, some of them are acting as a receptor to be responsive to some specific particular type of molecule. So to name several examples, so there should be a glucose receptor which only specifically recognize and is able to interact or bind, like let's say this is a glucose molecule, and then they will have a highly specific interaction, just like the antigen and antibody interactions. So then once they recognize this docking, then this receptor protein can somehow alert. Okay, so these arrows indicate the signal coming from this particular stimulus. If this is glucose, then this receptor protein specific for glucose now can send this signal, hey, I got this glucose grabbed. Okay, which means there are plenty of glucose outside, so at least for the time being we would be safe, that we don't really have too much to worry about, like the starvation. There will be plenty of nutrients available outside. Similarly, many different receptor proteins can be present on the same cell membrane, each of which recognize very specific molecule as its very unique specific stimulus, so that it can send the respective signal to the internal part of the cell to relay this information. So in the case of getting back to this the glucose receptor, the binding, the interaction can signal that we do have plenty of nutrients in the form of glucose, but not being able to bind for a long time this glucose can also signal that the opposite scenario. So, we cannot find any decent amount of the glucose, so we better be frugal. So we better actually save our energy, because we never know when the glucose is going to be available. Type of information can be relayed after sensing this type of environmental situation. So those are basically the type of job being carried out by many different types of receptors present on the cell membrane of all the living cells. So this doesn't only happen in the eukaryotic cells, but also the prokaryotic cell, like a bacterial cell, should also have their own many different types of receptors, so that they can also cooperate and have the respective the response to environmental conditions. On the other hand, these transporter proteins they are similar to receptor in that each different transporter protein can recognize a specific type of molecule. However, the difference here is now it's not about only like recognize and then bind, and then as a consequence being able to send the signal. So it's not about sending signal anymore, but their primary function is like allow the passage of this particular type of molecule. Okay. Here in this example of the cartoon, as this arrow indicate to the outside, this transporter is acting as a like exporter, so shipping this molecule from inside of the cell to the outside. But the similar type of transporter acting the opposite direction can also be possible. So I mean, I shouldn't say it's possible, it should be there present too. And it is extremely rare for any transporter that can work in bidirectionally, in that any single transporter can allow transport of this as well as the other opposite direction. That is a kind of a very rare. Why? Because this mechanism, the way it works, is highly selective and highly controlled, regulated. So that's why it is not really common for any type of a protein, transporter protein, being able to this both ways of transport action. Now, on the other hand, the enzymes are the one that can speed up the chemical reaction. So this, through the action of this enzyme, the one molecule can be converted into something else. Like if we label this reagent A, then after this enzymatic reaction, this A could be converted into B, or this one of the very simplified, the typical the description of enzymatic reactions. But the thing is, enzymes can be present in the inside of the cell, as well as some other enzymes. In the case of some other enzyme, they can be present, put to in the internal as an integral the component of the cell membrane. So you can imagine several different types of proteins that are arranged on the surface of the cell, and all of them are doing. Think of the reason why the enzyme in this particular enzyme is present on the surface of the thing. So to have to facilitate some of the particular really needed chemical reactions on the cell surface, so that they can cooperate and then speed up, or maybe make the this adjustment to the outside of the environment more efficient, probably. And on another type of such protein present on the surface is type of mechanical support protein. Its function is to, for example, over here, so anchor. Like when you commute on subways, you usually, on subways you don't really do, but when you are on the bus, usually you have to grab the bar, so that in order not to fall, or just like similarly, this anchor protein stabilize the present particular position of the cell among, so it enables the interaction, stable attachment of any particular cell in the multicellular environment, especially. So to sum up, there are many different types of proteins are present on the cell surface, and receptor is one of them. Actually, this is one of them, the major such membrane protein, and their major function is like responding to the external environment is mainly carried out by these receptor proteins. So once again, there should be so many different types of receptor proteins should be present on the cell surface, because a cell should be able to interact recognize and interact and adjustment to each of different types of external stimulus. And then once you have this reception of the signal, well, if that particular stimulus is in many cases be a hormone or any other type of environmental stimulus, and once they have this binding interaction, then those signals can be relayed into the inside of the critical location, so that where that final response is made, so that overall their adjustment can be enhanced to this particular type of stimulus. And overall, this type of signal relay, the action is called the signal transduction. But that type of the molecular jargon, we don't really need to worry about memorizing it. You have this reception, and the signal is being transmitted, and then finally a proper response is generated. That's all we need to know about it. So that's against some changing environment, so that we also change ourselves to accommodate such a change. This another example of a common characteristic is just called homeostasis. Is a little bit kind of different in that instead of trying to adjust itself towards the changing waves of external environment, here through this homeostasis, we usually call this as trying to maintain the homeostasis. The action is trying to maintain, even though notwithstanding the varying external environment, internal, we as a living cell, we try to maintain several sets of specific internal parameter stable and constant, okay, even under the very changing environment. The examples abound in that, like, no matter what the outside temperature fluctuate, especially the warm-blooded animals like mammals and the birds, and they try to maintain their particular temperature, usually that's 37 degrees Celsius, whether outside the climate temperature is, be it 4 degrees Celsius or even 40 degrees Celsius. That's one such example of homeostasis. Here, another example is pH. The pH means it's a kind of a indication of how acidic or how alkaline and the particular chemical environment. Usually, the environment made up of in solution is what usually we use the pH as an indicator of such a status. So, like, if the environment is too acidic, the pH value should be below 7.0. Okay? And if the environment is above, like it's a highly alkaline condition, then the pH should be above the 7. So pH 7 is a neutral condition. About pH, maybe we might have another opportunity in the following chapter to look at least a little more about, although briefly, about this pH related stuff. And another example is in trying to maintain certain particular ion. So here the ion means a charged element is called ion. So like calcium is element, but calcium ion is when it becomes ionized, it has a positive, electrically speaking, calcium ions. And also sodium ion is another example. And chloride, in this case, is a negative ion. So these type of several such ion need to be maintained at a specific concentration because their presence is very critical for our proper functioning. So that's another example. And we should be more familiar about this blood pressure maintenance. If you fail in maintaining certain proper range of blood pressure, then you will suffer from either hypertension or hypotension. Neither of them is an ideal condition for your health. It's like that. So here we can take a look at such two examples of maintaining in the cell, maintaining the homeostasis. The first example above in this figure is you're trying to maintain a constant, a certain level of blood sugar. If you fail, then you will experience a certain medical condition of diabetes, obviously. So the hormone, two different hormones, these are like examples of to show how usually in our cell internally are able to maintain a specific parameter of the condition in the form of this maintenance of homeostasis. So that's why I picked up these two examples. In the case of blood sugar maintenance, two different hormones are in action. They are, one is an insulin and the other one is the glucagon, and these are acting in opposite directions. So like if the insulin is trying to as a result of the action of the insulin, as this blue arrow indicate, the blood sugar, it's like just a seesaw in balance. The blood sugar level will drop as a result of the insulin action, but then in response to this, so that this response not to make this response to become to overblown, so the opposite activity effect of hormone glucagon will try to balance so that the blood sugar level will be increased if glucagon, the hormone, is activated. And these two different types of hormone is always in check, so that as a balancing action of these two hormones, normally if you are a healthy individual, usually the blood sugar level is maintained at a certain safe or healthy level. Is an example. And here this dot arrow indicate that this condition is somehow delivered to the other guy so that they can sense what's going on, and then in response to that, this insulin will actually take an action, is what usually something is being operated. In the case of let's take a look at another example here. In blood, also, not only is the blood sugar level, but many other different conditions, including this calcium ion. Calcium ion level also is very important. So cells need to maintain a constant certain level of, not too much or not too little, calcium level. And likewise in this case too, two different hormones acting in opposite direction. One is calcitonin, and as you can see in this diagram, calcitonin will lower the blood calcium level, and against this action, another hormone, the PTH, standing for parathyroid hormone, which is produced in the parathyroid gland, whereas this calcitonin is produced in the thyroid gland. That is also kind of a similarity in the case of this blood sugar level regulation by these two hormones. Both of them are produced in the same type of organ, pancreas, but in two different type of cells. One is in alpha cell and the other one is in beta cells. And here also same thyroid, but a slightly different location, the thyroid gland and the parathyroid gland in the similar area, and two oppositely working hormones produced and act against to each other. So this is actually for that reason, these two are very good examples of such internal cellular levels of the homeostasis maintenance. Another important thing that we need to take note about homeostasis is it is a highly active process. So here, when you look at this, the end result of the homeostasis, they are maintained on a level basis. So it looks like, it appears to us, to the observer's eyes, it appears to be a kind of, they have reached at a certain equilibrium. Okay. However, that equilibrium is a little bit misleading if you consider the typical equilibrium of chemical reactions, which we call as a chemical equilibrium. That is something, the chemical equilibrium is reached as a result of this, the spontaneous reaction, so that at the end of this chemical equilibrium, usually at both ends, the reactant and product ends, they do have same level, equal level of the energy status, which is highly stable, so which will result in the lowest entropy values, as we went over in the previous session. However, in the case of this homeostasis, that equilibrium is a little bit different, to be recognized as something differently as like dynamic equilibrium. Why dynamic equilibrium we recognize? Because it requires the energy input. So this certain level of status quo, seemingly status quo, is actually the result of a constant input, constant supply of energy. So that is fundamentally distinguishable from so-called the chemical equilibrium. Okay? So, as I said, chemical equilibrium is a result of the spontaneous reaction, whereas this dynamic equilibrium, which is observed in the case of homeostasis, is a result of that something that after supplying constant energy input. That's why it is called an active dynamic equilibrium. So here, this is actually this example, the figure. I took it from the a little bit advanced level of undergraduate cell biology textbook. In that textbook, this figure was shown to explain the concept of homeostasis. Taking this amoeba, one is alive here. The left side amoeba is alive. So when it is alive, it is active in taking in the food molecule and metabolize to extract the energy, and so they are so active. And when it is alive, when someone measures the amount of ATP versus ADP, ATP is the fully charged one, ADP is exhausted battery, okay, if you take the analogy. And then you invariably always witness this high discrepancy of the ATP versus ADP. ATP, amount of ATP is far exceed that of ADP. Okay, so you may think that this the type of constant value, like they looks like that they reached at some kind of a specific their own balance. So you may think, oh, so this must be a on its own merit, it must be their own type of equilibrium, similar to chemical equilibrium. But then no, you're wrong, because the minute this amoeba unfortunately deceased, when you do the same measurement in a dead amoeba, now all of a sudden what you can discover is total reverse of this, the concentration difference. Like ADP, the concentration of ADP far exceed that of the ATP. Now actually this is the true value of the result out of the chemical equilibrium. How do you know? Because if you think about this, ATP versus ADP, which one? If you think about this, ATP, let me try to explain this using the blackboard. Really, I haven't used this blackboard a while. So, like if you try to make the conversion of from ATP to ADP, or the vice versa, which direction do you think is a spontaneous reaction? From ATP to ADP would be what? It is catabolic or anabolic. This must be a catabolic reaction, and ADP to ADP must be an anabolic reaction. So, in which direction do you need an energy input? Obviously this, you need to put an energy, right? So in other words, this direction is non-spontaneous, right? And this direction from ATP to the ADP must be spontaneous. So what did I say about this chemical equilibrium? Chemical equilibrium is reached as a result of this spontaneous reaction. It is actually one of the example of very good example of a spontaneous reaction. So now what you are looking at now for here, this is a result of a spontaneous reaction, chemical equilibrium. And then what is this then? Oh, it must be something that the other way around. You know that. Now, from ADP to ATP, you know how hard it is. It is a non-spontaneous reaction. So, if you want to make, even with this type of relationship in terms of the energetics, if you found that in the cell, why do I have this? If you found that in the cell what you saw is high amount of this ATP versus ADP like that, then you should know immediately that you must have done something, like you must have provided huge amount of constant energy to maintain this unequal, like this non-chemical equilibrium like condition as a type of their own specific equilibrium. That's why it is such a good example of dynamic equilibrium, which is an indication of homeostasis. Okay, maybe it's a little bit of not necessarily too much complicated things about this dead versus alive amoeba to showcase the homeostasis. But okay, then if so, just forget about everything else, but simply try to put this thing in your mind, that the homeostasis, the particular unique thing about this homeostasis is an active process that requires the energy input. That something is the one that distinguishes this homeostasis from the other typical, the equilibrium, equal things you used to know about. The next characteristics of a common life form is growth and development. In both cases, like growth, development. Growth is simply you are increasing your body mass, is a growth. But in development, it's not only about you increasing your body size, but also you have to do something extra, is what it takes in the development. It's just like you have to accompany and accomplish some specific thing which we call the differentiation, right? The differentiation. So but in both growth and development, there is a common denominator which is involved equally in both the cases, which is the cell division. Either for the growth, in order to achieve growth as well as to achieve the development, you have to take care of this cell division. You have to do this many rounds of cell division. So that is the common denominator. But the difference here is growth is simply you try to increase your body mass through this cell division. So in this case, we recognize this event as a cell proliferation. However, in case of the development, this particular wording, okay, ring a bell? Differentiation, which is a hallmark of what? The multicellular organism, right? So in other words, the single cellular, unicellular organism cannot feature the luxury of this, the development. It only pertains to the multicellular organism, right? Although both unicellular and multicellular organism both can achieve this growth, only slightly different ways. In the case of a multicellular organism, growth means simply you increase your body mass through the cell division, and those increased number of cells still remain as part of yourself, right? That's the one particular characteristic of any multicellular organism. Whereas in case of a unicellular, single-celled organism, simply growth means increasing the number of your same kind through cell division. So here, even though they achieve the growth through this cell division, but each newly generated cells don't become an integral part of, attached and integral part of yourself, previous yourself. All of them, the newly generated cells will maintain as their own independent entity, but still we recognize those events as growth in the case of the unicellular organism. So that's the difference. So unicellular organism, unfortunately, all they can have among these two is the growth aspects. On the other hand, the multicellular organism, this growth, they cannot only have this and then simply neglect the other part, the development. Always this growth and the development should go together. Otherwise, they will be simply labeled and cursed as cancers, right? So here, in this figure, it shows that it started, and it's a multicellular organism, even though they are multicellular at adults, consisting of several trillions of many numbers of cells. However, the beginning was simple, just like everybody else, and it started with a single cell. The half of your father and half of your mother combined together to restore this fullness. We are going to take a look at in this aspect from the genetic viewpoint in a minute here. And then they do this initially. They only focus on very rapid cell division like crazy in the initial stage of this development. And then once they reach a certain number of cells after this, many rounds of incessant cell division, and then now for them to slow down, and maybe we should start thinking about this differentiation aspect, and then they take care of this differentiation even before they are born from mothers inside. So you already have developed into very specific different types of tissues, cells and tissues, as you can see on this figure. So that's an illustration of this growth and development aspect of living cell, in particular the multicellular organism. Now, next thing is about reproduction and heredity as part of another the common characteristics. So here, reproduction and heredity, why these two things are viewed as the same thing, integral thing. It's because one cannot be separated and then considered without the other. So this is actually the mechanism by which the one's genome, the entire makeup of one's gene is called the genome. Here, signifies the entire whole thing. So you do have, we don't care how many actually genes you have. If you are a human, perhaps you may carry about 22 or 23,000, only that much different genes. But the whole together, that whatever you have, so whether it be 23 or 22,000 genes, entire thing, then we call that whole thing as a genome, okay? The entire genes. So try to pass this entire gene without any damage or some missing part. Just trying to pass the entire thing into the next generation. So by doing so, you are achieving the continuous life starting from your whole long time ago. So your first ancestor, whether it be the first ever ancestor we call as a Luca or not. So the only practical way you can achieve this is through this reproduction, because you cannot, as one individual, you cannot live forever with your physically wearing down the material from, as you see, your cells aspect. So this is the only way we can think of that. Alternatively, you can achieve the continuity of life through this reproduction and through which you are passing. Not only you split into two, but you are exactly dividing your whole gene into the resulting two newcomers of your descendants. But this reproduction as actually the means of reproduction actually have two different ways. One is called asexual reproduction. It does not involve the partnership of a male and female things. And surprisingly, many number of different organisms are actually relying on this asexual reproduction for this continuity of life. And if you are engaged in this asexual reproduction mechanism, then the resulting new cells after the cell division is exactly a clone. That's the one distinct characteristics, because here there is not any different individual as your partner in generating your future generation. So all you gotta do is you simply pass what you have, the existing one, into the next generation. That's what you do in asexual reproduction. The one thing is, whether it's asexual reproduction or sexual reproduction, in order for you to pass your whole entire gene into the resulting next generation, which is always like at least the minimal, the newcomers minimum number is 2. So if you have originally certain amount of your genome, then if you simply split what you have into 2 halves, if you have 1, and then if you allocate what you have into 2 equal halves like this, then both of these guys are in big trouble, because what they have inherited is they are only half the amount of your entire genome, which is entirely not enough, but simply is a big disaster. So what you really need to do, take care of before you commit any cell division, is DNA duplication, right? Or it is also called the DNA replication. Wow. Only by doing so you can temporarily double up what you have into, and then you just cut all you have into exactly equal half, so that the emerging new generation, each of these two new generation cells, can inherit entirely intact genome. Is the reason why this DNA duplication or replication is so important. So in this figure of asexual reproduction, let's say if you had 50 chromosomes in imaginary organisms, you temporarily duplicate each of your 50 chromosomes, and then each replica, just like the twin, identical twin, and then you split each them into equal partition. Then, as a result, no harm is done to any of these two new cells. By the way, these two new cells through cell division, we conventionally call them as a daughter cell, not the son cell. So that's what it is. So that you will generate the clones in the case of asexual reproduction. On the other hand, this sexual reproduction, as you know, because you are the one actually reproducing through this sexual reproduction usually, and so the offspring, the new generations of genome is not identical. It's not going to be identical to either one of these two parental genome, because it is a type of mixture, a reshuffling of these two genomes, a father and mother's genome, is combined and recombined. So that is the very distinct and also distinct characteristic and also distinct advantage of sexual reproduction over asexual reproduction. Even though this sexual reproduction is in many ways it's not really efficient in that it is expensive. They have to spend too much more energy as compared with that case of asexual reproduction, and also it is very difficult, inconvenient to properly find a partner. So many different types of the difficulties, interference you have to go through. But even with that, the reason why so many different organisms are so crazy about this sexual reproduction is because it has a very clear advantage in a specific, especially in a specific situation like a changing environment, because your next generation, your offspring's genome will be diverse, different. So whenever you have this variation, diversity is always a good thing, because at least one of your offspring will have a better chance of adapting to whatever those changed environment will lead us to any destination. At least some of them will be able to adjust better than the others. But if you think about the monotonous, identical in terms of their genetic variability because they were the result of asexual reproduction, it is always like a hit or miss. Okay? Because the way they respond to any specific stimulus will be usually kind of identical due to their genetic identity. So it's an all or nothing usually, the response. That is very risky. Okay, so here in sexual reproduction, because of that, you actually get to produce some very specialized type of a cell, which is called the gamete. Okay, this gamete is the special type of cells that are only involved in the business of sexual reproduction. Okay? And they are destined to recombine together. So the gametes from yourself, if you are a female, and the gamete from a male later through this sexual reproduction will combine together, to fuse together, and kind of mysteriously we describe it as restoring their status, which means you get to produce this gamete as a kind of half the identity. And once half the identity of a gamete recombine together, then you get to restore your identity into zygote as you were before. So here in the organism reproduces sexually, there are two different types of cells. One is so-called normal body cell. We call it, let's say it's, in layman's terms, normal body cell. So many. So the vast majority of cells would be these normal body cells that you can find in any area of your body. And kind of a sophisticated version of this normal body cell is we call it a somatic cell. Somatic cell. Okay. In contrast, these special cells that engage in the sexual reproduction task is called, normally it's called, you can call them as a sex cells, of course, but usually biologists prefer calling them as this type of a specific terminology. It's called a gamete. And the difference between this somatic and the gametes is their amount of DNA in chromosome. So in normal somatic cells, so to speak, they have always 2 sets of chromosome. So you have 1 extra for each of your gene, or each of your, or the area of the gene organized in chromosome. 2 sets. Why do you have this extra set? Because if you trace back down your origin, you are nothing but the combination of the father's part and the mother's part to fuse together, which means you got to inherit half the whole genome from your father, and half of them came from your mother. So it is obviously it is necessary that you carry some duplicated version of the whole these chromosomes. On the other hand, this gamete, they don't have such a luxury, but they must actually. It's not about something about the luxury or not, but gametes always have to have only 1 set of chromosome. Why? If not, you are in big trouble. As a gamete, example is gamete: sperm if you are male, and egg if you are a female. Okay, so either as a sperm or an egg, if you do not have any, have only 1 set of chromosome, but instead if you had 2 sets of chromosome, then what would happen after you get succeeded in the sexual reproduction to become zygote? Your total genetic makeup would be something abnormal. Okay? Unlike having only 2 sets of chromosome, you will have at least extra 1 more set of chromosome due to this neglect. So that is the reason why, if you are going to play as gamete, you better have this, absolutely have this, the hefty amount of genome. So there is actually a specialized term describing this. So the gamete having only 1 set of chromosome we call as haploid. Having only 1 set of whole genes we describe using this term. And what about somatic cell? Having 2 sets of chromosome, so it should be called diploid. Well, if you actually somehow accidentally get to have not 2 but 4 different sets of chromosomes, then you should be called differently, something like a, not as a diploid, but probably something like a tetra, for meaningful tetraploid. And those tetraploid organisms also exist, but they are not kind of normal. Okay, maybe I'm just spending too much time over here. Always that's my problem. So this is an illustration of such the diploid and haploid things in the case of a sexual reproduction. So depending on who you are in your the gender, so like you either produce egg as a gamete or sperm as a gamete. But regardless whether it is an egg or a sperm, you have in the case of a human, you only have a 23 chromosome, whereas in the normal body, all the cells, even at the stage of this zygote, the number of chromosomes are 46, twice the amount of characters that you find in gametes. Why? Because in the zygote is made after fusing or combining both eggs and sperm's genome, so that's why you have this double genome in the case. So that is the type of relationship between the gamete and the normal somatic cells in terms of the genome size. And the last common characteristics that we are going to look over is the evolution, which is a theory that explains the unity and diversity of life, which I mean by that the unity of all these different organisms you get to observe in these days. They are all unique and different. You can easily get the idea even just by glimpse of an idea of whenever you imagine the different human populations. Yes. However, even with that, you do have the striking similarity among all such different individual organisms. So this coexistence of these two seemingly contradicting feature of unity and diversity is wherever you go, you get to find in living organisms. And actually, this is the evolution try to explain these two features observed at the same time, is because all living forms of life are actually originated from a single common ancestor. That single common ancestor is designated as a LUCA, standing for last universal common ancestor. So of course, in this so-called version of the evolutionary tree diagram, we call it a phylogenetic tree. So you usually try to express this relationship by drawing up this tree diagram. Oh, what's going on? Something like this. Of course, in reality, this tree pattern is much more complex, far more complex than this mere funny looking diagram. But the point is, the starting point over here, situated over here, is the position of LUCA. Here, at several intermediate position, every branching point at the base of this splitting point of this branch are occupied by any intermediate common ancestors, of course. However, the very first common ancestor is kind of a counterintuitive, that we call the first common ancestor as the last common ancestor. But anyway, you get the idea. And because of that, you cannot escape from like bearing certain common features you inherited from this single ancestral form, is what this idea try to depict. So here, starting from LUCA, all these present days three big groups like eukaryotes, all different eukaryotes, and and the big group of prokaryotic bacteria, and another independent prokaryotic group we call the archaebacteria, archaea, are all descend from a single LUCA. For this, probably there is an opportunity for us to get to talk about a little more in detail in the following chapters. So I will just, so here, this, if you zoom in the tree branching diagram, actually it indicates that all these eukaryotes share the common ancestor at the base of the branching point with the archaea, not with the bacteria. You might actually have expected that we are much closer to the bacteria rather than archaebacteria, but that is not the case. According to this idea of evolution, this particular force provided by environment, the natural environment, we recognize natural selection. So those who have a better adaptability to the particular environment will be able to have a better chance of the survival or reproductive success. And this intensifying this process over time will result in eventually some new species arose from the rest, is what the basic idea is. So first we have to be able to define what is species. There are several different versions of the definition for the species. However, to those who are engaged in the sexual reproduction, it is the most straightforward, easy to understand concept, which is we call it the biological species definition, under which a species is defined as a group of interbreeding, mating together. So an ability to be able to mate together is the key here. So like chimpanzee and human are not part of the same species, because no matter what, even though they are closely related, the most closely related to species, but an individual member of human cannot mate with an individual of chimpanzee and then can produce any viable offspring, which is another requirement, the viable and fertile offspring. So like if you remind the case of the mating between a horse and donkey, which is doable by forcing, a human can force horse and donkey to mate, and then it is possible to produce a viable offspring, a mule. But it is healthy, but unfortunately the mule, as a result of this mating between donkey and horse, cannot produce any offspring, so it is sterile. So that clearly shows that no, horse and donkeys are not member of the same species. Of course, there is more intrinsic differences between horse and donkey in terms of their molecular and physical nature. That's why they cannot reproduce, they cannot mate. But regardless, this concept, if we apply this biological species concept, it works. So this new speciation, how this new speciation from the existing group of a population can arise, the 5 steps of, or 5 key elements must exist for this process to successfully occur. These are variation and heredity and overpopulation and fitness, and finally, as a result of all these 4 conditions are met, then some adaptation can result in the evolution of a new species, is what it is saying. So first of this variation is the difference between trait, the individual carrying different traits, okay, represent different variation in a population. Remember, population, what's the definition of population? Try to recall what we have seen in the previous session of the lecture. So here the different traits for a given character. So perhaps it's like we need to define more accurately about trait and character in English. Although in Korean it is very difficult to distinguish the trait and character. If you look up the dictionary, both trait and character is expressed in the same Korean wording, which is this. But clearly in English it is different. So for example, the eye color is one such example of a character. So the character is, so to speak, you can think character as a category. So the obviously eye color, assuming that it is actually eye color is determined by gene. Actually, in the case of human eye color, multiples of genes are involved in determining one particular type of eye color. But whatever. But simply ignore and assume, for the sake of convenience, let's assume that one single gene is responsible for determining human eye color. Okay, that gene. And so this is a such character. Example of a different type of character. Eye color is one such character. Height, another type of character. Body weight could be another character. Like your skin color could be another character. Intelligence, and you name it. Your particular category of something that trait. Okay, kind of silly version of explanation. But under a given character, you can have several different versions of traits. So in the category of a human eye color, you can have a black eye, which is a type of one example of a trait under eye color character. And also you can have a brown, and you can have a blue and red. And not only that, these are not all, some more extra other variation. So this is the definition and distinction between trait and character. So any different traits for a given character, which is carried by different individual among the members of the population, will portray different variation, and each different variation will be subjected to a selection by nature, the environment. Any particular change in the environment now will influence whether certain particular trait can adjust itself, adapt. Will it help the individual adjusting to a changed environment, or it will interfere? So that's the something that what makes difference for this adaptability of an individual carrying different trait. So there should be a variation in trait. Imagine the other way around. If you don't have any variation existing in the beginning in the population, then any kind of a selection force cannot be applied, because it will always be an all or none response. It's like monotonous, homogeneous, genetically homogeneous population, and they are clones, so it will be almost identical, like in terms of the way they respond to a specific stimulus. Okay. So everybody will die, or everybody will prosper, and then that is not something that is going to work along with this scheme. And the other thing very important is that trait should be able to be passed on to the next generation, heritable. Okay. If that variation is not heritable, then you have to start all over again in the next generation once again. So give you an example, like if a certain trait is not an heritable one but an acquired as a result of such an acquired trait like this, quickly you can think of an example, like you go to the gym and work out so hard, so you build up muscle. That is another very distinct trait. Okay, can make any difference with others. However, that particular trait of a muscly feature is not inherited into your next generation of your sons and daughters. So your sons or daughters will not be born with your already established your muscle feature. Okay. And then at the level of your generation, you may be able to enjoy some kind of advantage of being better adapted to this particular condition of the environment, but it does not apply to the next generation of yours, which means the importance, the why this adaptability is so important is that it has to affect your gene pool. All it matters is whether you can spread your gene, how much, how well, how large, how broadly can you spread your gene in your population. That will eventually determine whether your particular type of a gene makeup will dominate or not. And depending on particular characteristic of this entire population will be formulated is what is going to happen about. So this acquired trait, which is usually obtained through the adaptation to the environment, is not considered to be heritable because it is not something that involves the change in the DNA sequences. Okay? Only something that inscribed so hard into your DNA can be passed on to the next generation. That is firmly established by the founder of this genetics, which is the Gregor Mendel. That renowned, at the time of his generation, he was not really renowned, but Mendel, who established who was the founder of this classical genetics. Before Mendel, nobody knew any kind of idea about what gene is, but it's like a genius. So Mendel was correctly able to pinpoint accurately that what's genes. So environment can play around, however, it does not lead to the change in the gene, so it is not heritable, is the concept. And everyone knows that, at least seemingly. However, really? So let's wait until, because this is another area that is about to be changed in a very short near future, because with the more modern new information, then we are on the verge of making some changes in the originally what we have believed as some kind of a golden rule. So this is another such an example. So that's that. And then also overpopulation is another condition that should be met if the natural selection were to successfully be applied. So here always this overpopulation is a relative term, and with regards to the amount of resources, but usually in reality the resources is limited. So always this overpopulation will create this competition, which means only not everybody can. So only under this condition can actually the selection can work. If everybody is so good about and relaxed, then the environment is not going to be able to actually put any pressure, then everyone will have an equal chance of why this overpopulation is so important. If you don't have this kind of overpopulation in relationship, relatively speaking, with regard to your limited resources, then everyone in your population will have an equal chance of a survival or equal chance of this reproductive success. Okay, so survival or this reproductive success is what really matters in and affecting the outcome of this selection. So if everything that is being mentioned in this category is actually fulfilled, and then evolution through this adaptation procedure under this particular environment we recognize as natural selection, will result in eventually a new speciation. Why? Because eventually the particular makeup of the gene set carried by originally from a specific group or few individuals will eventually in the long run predominate that area of the population, and then everybody else will be the descendants almost. Okay? So now then this character, the traits, will become very, very peculiar, and it's not really intermingled with the rest of things. So now you stand as a unique, distinguishable group of new population. Now we recognize as a new species, because usually it will follow some of this reproductive isolation, which means now this group can no longer interbreed with the others. So now officially, now we declare you as an independent new species is what is going to happen. So this diagram is trying to explain basically the same thing what I have just explained up until now, but in a slightly different angle, so you can actually compare and then follow and then check your understanding later. So actually finally this early theory of evolution by Lamarck is a kind of a historic the merit is because although Charles Darwin was the first one who actually ever correctly formulate the idea of evolution through natural selection, but even before Charles Darwin, another renowned scientist at the time, Jean Baptiste Lamarck, thought about his own idea, and to his credit, actually, this was the first ever cohesive explanation for the process of evolution. His idea was based upon disuse theory, which is well known to us. If you get to use a lot, then you get to develop, and if you don't use, then it will become obsolete, and then it will disappear, kind of. In a lot of cases, actually, that bears a truth, but not every cases, especially in the case of his version of evolutionary idea, using the case of this giraffe's long extended neck. He assumes that originally the ancestral giraffe was a kind of a short necked animal, which is in physical appearance which is more similar to other related animals like horses and the zebras. However, a certain particular condition of an environment forced them to give a hard effort to reach out to a source of food up in the height, and that individual efforts continued throughout several successive generations. So this gap, they kept working on their effort of stretching, and then it worked. Maybe at your own generation, if you did this, you may be able to actually achieve a little bit of extending neck. Who knows? You don't know. However, here the point is, each individual will, through by their own effort, will be able to portray some variation in the trait is one thing, one big assumption. Okay, usually considers to be not true. Okay, but he just assumed that it is possible. And if that was the case, then it must be obviously a kind of acquired trait. And we all know that any kind of acquired trait is not heritable. But he assumed and he strongly believed that this acquired trait is heritable. So that are the two major points of the so-called pitfall of Lamarck's idea, because at least uh, from what you have learned in the high schools or in middle school, if you recall, if you ever took any biology, this is something everybody decisively say that that is not correct because of these two reasons. One, you cannot create any variation by individual own the effort, and the other, worse yet, is that acquired trait is not heritable. And if you compare his idea with that of Charles Darwin, then the difference becomes more pronounced. So he assumed, by contrast, this Charles Darwin assumes that this trait variation is not something that came out of all of a sudden individual the effort under specific environmental changes, but it's already a pre-existing condition. It's already there, but it's simply not noticeable because it doesn't have to be on the general normal, I shouldn't say normal, but any particular conditions until that environmental change actually acts as a selective force. So now it's time for any this environmental change act as a force for this natural selection, and this particular trait, which is now able to show any the feature adaptability, can be refined and then further emphasized over next generations through this selective mating among the individuals carrying this particular the trait, then further can be developed into so then until it can be as a creation of a new species. Like in this diagram, so according to him, already variations do exist, but under this pre-existing condition, these variation in the length of necks do not have any kind of influence on the success, reproductive success, or any survivability of a particular individuals. But due to the climate change or anything, whatever, then now this height difference may be able to become determining factor in whether a particular individual can be able to better survive, or even some can have a better chance of finding a mate. So through this refinement, this particular trait can be further refined and then pronounced until so everybody in the population carries this particular trait of a long neck. Now it's just become a new species. What his version of the explanation, which is more plausible. Yeah, that's what it is. However, one thing is, in these more recent days, this so-called acquired trait not being able to be passed on to the next generation is now being overturned. So this new emerging idea of that some, if not all, some acquired traits can be heritable. Oops. And it's been proven. The difference between acquired trait and then the classical concept of the trait is whether it is true, it results in through the process of change in gene, the DNA sequences. So in the classical viewpoint, the only traits that are heritable is the one that resulted from the change in DNA sequences. However, some of the traits can be expressed without involving the DNA sequence change. For example, some of the example is this gene expression change can become a legitimate different trait in that if you think about the amount of growth hormone expression can be different among different individuals. So that amount of gene expression cannot be simply the result of absolute change in DNA sequence differences. Actually, at this point, some of you may not be able to understand exactly what's the difference, but simply follow me, bear with me. Yeah, this is what it is. In that case, even with the higher amount of growth hormone produced and the less amount of growth hormone produced, either of these two individuals, if you compare that the growth hormone gene itself, there is no difference in the growth hormone gene sequence itself. But still, you do have a difference in the amount of this growth hormone produced through various, some of them are environmental and some others are not. But obviously, it shows the difference in the form of your trait. Some who produce higher, more amount of growth hormone will become the bigger in body and then taller, and those who don't will be like the other opposite type of this trait. So that is another example of this one, such an example of this, the amount of gene expression playing in this as a alternative, like a trait to the DNA sequence based trait. So, and then what they have found is to make this whole complex story simple at this point. And this changed, altered pattern of this expression can be remembered by the cell in the following generational. And then they will maintain exactly particular type of condition, and then that particular trait maintained by this particular pattern of gene expression will be maintained in the following generations over a long time, is what actually what's been observed as the case. And collectively, those type of this is not something we don't know totally. It's epigenetics, which means that the traits which doesn't involve the DNA sequence changes, or this epigenetics is actually, it is a very hot modern topic. So obviously more studies need to be done to finally we have actually more accurate and detailed information about this epigenetics. But nonetheless, this epigenetics is another emerging, up and coming, so to speak, concepts of the genetics. So the take-home message of this is everything changes, and here in the example of the epigenetics, you get to witness another such example of nothing will stay the same in science. Is a basic take-home message. And by the way, this is an extra gravy in that. Actually, another study, recent study, shows that actually giraffes' neck might not actually have played any factor in obtaining the food over the high treetop positions, because during this series of experiment, it appears that giraffes usually do not try to reach up to their height for their food. Usually they try to get the food sources and then much lower than his actual potential, his or her potential height, like this. Obviously, of course, this is only something that can be observable under normal environmental condition. But what if that all those available food at the lower level of the height all disappeared, and then only those food that on the high treetops remain available? Then that would be a totally different scenario. So this study somehow does not really incorporate such a particular scenario. So maybe it's not 100% related with those concept of like inviting this giraffe's height in, or maybe the other way around, inviting this availability of a food and an ability to reach to the high top food source in establishing this evolution of the long-necked giraffe. But anyway, so this type of another kind of another angles of studies are always constantly being tried, is another just take a message. So finally here we are. So now we can try to sum up. Once again, let me emphasize that all those particular points as a common characteristic of life per se is not at all important, because it is not something that entirely agreed upon 100% by all those experts involved in this particular business. And then what's the point of simply trying to memorize each of these things as one of the common characteristics? That's just pointless. What's more important is like why they are, why they have to be here. So if we follow what we have learned up until now, is this: life, one characteristics, unmistakable characteristics, is life starts with cell, which is a kind of a unit of a complex, highly complex organization. And in the cell, once you have this cell, there's something for the reason that we cannot explain. Every cell try to accomplish this, so to speak, try to live forever. Immortality is the it appears to be everybody's ultimate goal for a living cell. And cell is actually one of the most important component of a cell is genes. And thanks to this feature of having genes, cells, all those living cells can seek an alternative approach to reach to this goal of being immortal. In that, you can try this reproduction. This is kind of an indirect way of living forever. So physically, your own entity may not be able to survive even over 100 years as a human, but instead you come up with this alternative idea of producing your copy. How do you make your copy, exact entire identical copy? Simply copying your gene, passing on to the next generation, and do this cell division. That's what it is, all about the reproduction. Okay. So reproduction involves obviously the duplication and copying and then passing your gene into the next generation. Now, because of these genes, what did I say about the nature of this DNA or genes? Spontaneously they will undergo change. We recognize as a mutation. So this DNA sequence variation, which occurs spontaneously over time, will inevitably create a variation in different individuals. Once you understand this, then you understand why and how the evolution will follow. So each individual with different variation, as we went along with, will be subjected to the natural selection, right? On the other side of this spectrum is, so each individual having this different trait, obviously, all of these different individuals will have to comply with and try to adapt to the best of their ability, adapt to a specific environment viewed as the process of the natural selection. But in the meantime, they always have to get the enough energy and being able to utilize it properly. So they have to do this metabolism. This is the only gate through which they can achieve this energy transaction things. And at the same time, you cannot neglect. It's just trying to be aware of what's going on. Otherwise, you will be quickly eliminated out of this system. And at the same time also, even though the outside environment is keep changing, but at the same time you have to be able to maintain certain particular important critical internal condition stable, constant, which is represented by this term homeostasis. That's why these three characteristics without any exception appear in every different type of individual. So all together will contribute to have an increase in individual adaptation, which will affect the competitiveness in the game of natural selection. So all of this will help in achieving this, the ultimate goal of living forever. And if you take care of all these features effectively, then you will be able to at a better position in this natural selection, so that eventually increase your chance of being able to live forever. And as I explained this, all this natural selection procedure will involve and will be reflected on the big group wide, the species level of adaptation, and now then only then we recognize it as the occurrence of evolution. With that, eventually we may be able to reach or not to this goal of living forever, is what whole things that you can organize itself. Okay, so that's probably something that I can complete the discussion of the first chapter's material, which is overall the introduction. So from that aspect, this introduction thing is very important. And on the flip side, so since this is kind of a surface scratching introductory thing, so you don't really have to spend too much time and effort to digest every bit of these things that dealt in this chapter. Is another way of looking at this. Either which hat you are going to wear is totally up to you. So with that, so I have to say goodbye, and then also with a little bit of apology, so that the lecture once again get to become a little lengthier. But I tried my best to shorten up, but it's me. What can I say? So with that.
I tell you a story about a girl. She likes to fly across the ocean with the air. She has no country, she doesn't care. She is a witch, she is a fairy killing bird. She needs no passports, she's everywhere. She burns her nights in Paris, breakfast in the Louvre. She drinks tequila, she's getting high. She burns that bloody firework up in the sky. Manhattan, a queen, lost in a dream. You left your home when you were only 17. You turned the whole with a spin, lost in an everlasting dream.